Scene 8. What remains? New Smyrna Colony and the Road North, September through November 9th, 1777. Part 1, Turnbull. He arrived in September, which was the wrong month to arrive at anything in East Florida. The heat was still absolute, still the same pressing liquid weight he had spent 9 years enduring in his plantation house, while other men worked in it. His ship had come through Mosquito Inlet on a morning of flat gray water, in the same dense green wall of mangrove he had first seen in August of 1768. And for a moment, standing at the bow, he had the particular sensation of a man who has been away so long that time has folded back on itself. As if the 9 years between his first arrival and this one had simply not occurred. As if he were arriving fresh from Gibraltar with 1,400 people behind him and everything still possible. Then the longboat brought him to the landing, and he stepped onto the dock and saw what was left, and the sensation dissolved. The settlement was not empty. That was what struck him first, in an almost absurd way. He had been braced somewhere in the crossing for complete abandonment, for a ghost colony, for silence. What he found was something stranger and, in its way, more terrible. The colony was still here. The overseers were still here, making their rounds on horses that had grown fat and slow in the months of reduced work. The wharves were still here, still sound. He had built good wharves. The canal system was still here. The drainage ditches he had spent 40,000 pounds designing and digging, still moving water from the fields to the inlet, with the patient efficiency of infrastructure that does not care who owns it. The indigo was still in the ground, in the fields that ran 7 miles along the Halifax River. Some of it had been harvested. Most of it had not. The plantation house was still here. The house Francisco Pellicer had built with his own hands. The house Turnbull had always meant as proof that this was not merely an enterprise, but a civilization. It sat in the heat at the north end of the settlement, its coquina foundation solid, its timber framing tight and dry, its windows looking out over fields that now held only the overseer's horses and the particular emptiness of land that has been cleared and does not intend to wait. And the enslaved men were still here. Of course they were. They had nowhere to go, and no one had offered them anywhere to go. And the legal machinery that had freed 1,400 indentured Europeans had no mechanism that extended to them. And so they stood in the familiar positions, in the familiar fields, in the familiar heat, and watched Turnbull come ashore with the particular stillness they had always brought to his arrivals. A stillness that gave nothing away and kept everything. He looked at them, and they looked at him, and after a moment he looked away, because there was no language available for what that exchange required. He found Father Camps in the hospital hut at the south end of the settlement, doing what Father Camps had always done, attending to the sick, which in this case meant 6 people too ill to have made the walk north, and who had been sent south again from St. Augustine by ship when it became clear they were going to die regardless, and the city had no room for the dying. Camps was thin in a way that suggested the summer had taken something from him that rest would not entirely restore. He had a bowl of water and a cloth, and he was moving from mat to mat with the measured efficiency of a man who has been doing this for 9 years and knows exactly how little it accomplishes and does it anyway. He looked up when Turnbull entered. Neither of them spoke for a moment. They had known each other for 9 years. Not well. Camps had no interest in Turnbull's company, and Turnbull had no particular need for a Catholic priest. But with the specific familiarity of 2 men who have operated in the same constrained space for a long time and understand each other's positions precisely, Camps knew what Turnbull was. Turnbull knew what Camps thought of what he was. "Father," Turnbull said finally. "Dr. Turnbull," Camps said, and went back to his patient. Turnbull looked around the hut, the six sick people on their mats. The smell, familiar. The particular compound of Florida heat and illness he'd been smelling for 9 years. Through the open wall, he could see the empty field that had been the Menorcan quarter. The rows of huts standing open and silent, the doors ajar or missing entirely. "Where is everyone?" he asked, which was a foolish question because he knew. "In St. Augustine," Camps said, "where they have every right to be." He did not let Camps leave. He had not planned this, had not arrived with any intention regarding the priest. But the afternoon of his first day back, when Camps appeared at the door of the plantation house with his traveling bag and the golden book under his arm, and announced that he would be departing for St. Augustine in the morning, something in Turnbull locked. "You will stay," he said, "until this matter is resolved." "What matter?" Camps asked. "The matter of the colony. The people who had abandoned their legal indentures and were sitting in St. Augustine on false promises from a governor who had exceeded his authority. The matter of Turnbull's livelihood and reputation, and the 40,000 pounds his partners had put into the ground here, all of which was being reviewed and contested in courts that had not yet completed their work." Camps looked at him for a long moment. "These people," the priest said carefully, "are free. Their contracts have expired by any reasonable reading. Tonyn has acknowledged this. The attorneys have acknowledged this. The courts, Turnbull said, have ruled in my favor." This was true. It had been true in July. Camps knew it was true. He also knew, as Turnbull knew, that Tonyn had set the ruling aside as casually as a man sets aside a letter he does not wish to answer, and had gone ahead and freed the colonists regardless. And that the ruling in Turnbull's favor was a piece of paper that had accomplished nothing except to demonstrate the gap between what the law said and what the governor intended to do. "The courts ruled in your favor," Camps said, "and your people are still in St. Augustine." "My people," Turnbull said, and the word had a complicated quality. Camps looked at his bag. He looked at the book. He looked at Turnbull with the expression of a man deciding which argument is worth making to a man who is no longer listening to arguments. "I have sick people," he said. "They need me." "Your sick people are here," Turnbull said, and gestured toward the hospital hut. There were 6 of them. There had been several dozen in July. Camps did not point this out. He unpacked his traveling bag and set the golden book on the table in his room and went back to his patients. And Turnbull went back to his study, and the plantation settled into the particular silence of a place that has been emptied of its purpose, but not yet released from its shell. Tonyn's letter arrived in October. Turnbull read it in the plantation house that Francisco had built, sitting in the chair he had brought from London, in the room with the maps on the wall. Maps that now showed a colony that no longer existed in any functional sense. The letter was formal and precise, and Tonyn had clearly enjoyed writing it. The governor informed Turnbull that he was being cited before the East Florida Court of Chancery. Which court, the letter noted with a brevity that conveyed disdain, was presided over by the governor himself. The charges included mistreatment of indentured workers, breach of contractual obligations, and conduct incompatible with his continued official standing in the province. A security bond would be required. Turnbull set the letter down. He looked at the maps. He looked at the field visible through the window, the indigo that would not be harvested, the canal system that would go on draining water regardless, the enslaved men moving in the distance with their tools. He had been in this country for 11 years. He had put everything into it. His ambition, his investors' money, his wife's name on the landscape, his reputation as a man who could build something lasting. He had believed, at the Privy Council steps in London with the grant document in his hands, that he was going to build something lasting. He thought about the bond. He thought about his accounts. He could not post the bond. They came for him in November, 2 weeks before Camps finally walked north. 2 men from St. Augustine with a court writ and the expressions of people carrying out a task they find neither pleasant nor unpleasant. Simply a task. Turnbull met them at the door of his plantation house and read the writ and stood for a moment in the Florida morning and looked at the settlement he had built and then looked at the road that led north to St. Augustine and then looked back at the settlement. The overseers were watching from the edge of the field. The enslaved men were watching from the field itself, with the same stillness they always brought to events that did not concern them, and always would. Turnbull folded the writ and put it in his coat. "I will require time to make arrangements," he said. The men said he had been given sufficient time. He accompanied them to the longboat. He did not look back at the house as the boat pulled away from the dock. And it is possible that this was dignity and possible that it was something else. The Halifax River was flat and gray that morning, and Mosquito Inlet smelled the same as it always had. Standing water, rotting vegetation, heat. And the mangroves lined the shore with the same dense indifference they had shown to every arrival and every departure this inlet had witnessed since before anyone whose name anyone remembered. He arrived in St. Augustine and was taken to jail because he could not post the bond the governor had set. Which bond the governor had set, knowing he could not post it. Part 2. Camps. The priest left on the 9th of November. He did not ask permission. There was no one left with sufficient authority over him to give or withhold it. The overseers had retreated to their own concerns. The legal proceedings had consumed Turnbull. The plantation was dissolving by the day. He woke before light, which was a habit 9 years old, and dressed in the dark and took his traveling bag from the corner of the room where it had been waiting since September, and lifted the golden book from the table and stood for a moment in the doorway of the room that had been his home and office and prison for 3 months. The room was plain. A table, a chair, a sleeping mat, a shelf where he had kept his vestments, which Turnbull had confiscated in the summer as punishment for his refusal to counsel his people to stay. A window that showed the eastern field in the gray pre-dawn, the stubble of the unharvested indigo moving slightly in the coastal wind. He had kept this room for 9 years. He had baptized children here, heard confessions here, written in the golden book here by the light of a tallow candle, while the colony breathed its sick breath outside. He had buried this room's dimensions in his body the way a man buries the dimensions of any place he has lived in long enough. Could have walked it blindfolded. Could have placed every object in it from memory. He left without looking back. Some things are better not to memorize. The 6 sick people. This was the difficulty he had been carrying since September. 3 of them had died in October, which was not unexpected, and which he had recorded in the Golden Book with the same steady hand he had used for every death since 1768. Name, approximate age, date, cause where determinable. The other 3 he had arrangements for. A Minorcan family living in a settlement several miles north of the colony had agreed to take them in, had come down in a cart the day before and collected them. And he had blessed them and watched the cart go north, and had walked back to his empty room and sat for a long time with the golden book open to the last entry. He was the last one. He had always known he would be the last. It was, in some sense, his calling. Not the grandiose version, but the plain one. The version that simply means, someone has to stay until it is finished. He walked out of the settlement at first light and did not look back. The King's Road north was the same road Francisco had walked in March, the same road the 90 had walked in April, the same road the hundreds had walked through May and June. It showed the evidence of all those feet, a track more worn than it had been, the grass on its edges flattened by the passage of carts, the ground along its margins disturbed where people had rested or taken water from the small streams crossing the track. Camps walked it alone. He was 48 years old. He had come to this country in 1768 as a man of 41, which was not young, but was manageable. And 9 years of Florida had done to him what 9 years of Florida did to everyone. Not broken him, but altered him in ways that were structural rather than superficial. He moved carefully on the bad ankle that had never properly healed after the hurricane of 1769. He wore the vestments Turnbull had kept from him all summer, because Turnbull was in jail and the vestments were his, and there was no one left to take them again. He carried the golden book under his left arm. In his right hand, he had a walking staff cut from a live oak branch, because the King's Road north was 70 miles and he was 48, and the ankle was bad. He walked. He arrived at the northern gate of St. Augustine on the afternoon of November 9th, 1777. He had been walking for 3 days. His vestments were dusty and his ankle had swollen, and he needed water and rest and a meal, none of which he stopped to think about, because there was something he needed to do first. The sentry at the gate looked at the small man with the walking staff and the book under his arm, and the expression of someone who has been traveling for 3 days and has arrived at the end of a very long journey. "Father," the sentry said, with the uncertainty of a young British soldier encountering a Catholic priest. "I am Pedro Camps," he said. "I am the pastor of the Menorcan community of this city. I have come to resume my duties." The sentry let him through. He walked north on St. George Street, which he had not seen since 1768, when the fleet had briefly stopped here before sailing south to Mosquito Inlet, with 1,400 people and all their hope and fear and the particular mixture of the two that becomes something else when there is no other option. The city was larger than he remembered. The streets smelled of wood smoke and salt fish and the animal warmth of human habitation. He followed the sound. It was not a loud sound. Voices, the clink of tools, the domestic noise of people constructing a life in a place they had not been before. He followed it north, to the settlement outside the walls where the small plots of sandy land had been assigned to his people. And he walked through it and recognized faces and was recognized. And there was no speech, not for a moment, just the particular recognition between people who have survived a thing together and have arrived, improbably, on the other side of it. He found a low wall and sat down on it. He set the golden book on his knee and opened it to the last entry, the last of the 6 deaths at the colony. And below it, in the careful small hand he had used since 1768, he wrote, "On the 9th day of November, 1777, the Church of San Pedro was translated from the settlement of Mosquito to the city of St. Augustine, with the same colony of Mahonese Menorcans which was established in the said settlement, and the same parish priest and missionary apostolic." He read it back. and he closed the book. Somewhere north of him, Francisco Pellicer was nailing a plank to the frame of the house he was building, the first house on the land that was his own. The sound of the hammer carried clearly in the November air. Camps sat on the wall and listened to it and felt the ankle and thought about where to sleep tonight. Because he was 48 years old and had walked 70 miles, and there was still, as always, so much work to do. Epilogue Francisco. He settled in St. Augustine, continued working as a master carpenter, bought property on St. George Street with Jose Peso de Burgo, built his own house. His first wife, Margarita, died around 1783. He remarried, had 9 more children with his second wife, Juana Villa. His daughter Juana, the baby born December 16, 1776, just weeks before he walked north, grew up and married a merchant named Andres Jimenez. The house Jimenez built for her in 1798 still stands on St. George Street today as the Jimenez Fatio House Museum. Francisco died in 1826 at approximately 79 years old, a free man on his own land. Pellicer Creek, south of St. Augustine, is named for him. He was named a great Floridian in 2000. Father Camps. He resumed his duties in St. Augustine immediately upon arrival November 9, 1777, and ministered to the Menorcan community until his death. He continued recording in the Golden Book baptisms, marriages, deaths, until 1784. The Golden Book survives. It has been translated and published. A statue of Father Camps stands outside the Basilica in St. Augustine today. The Catholic Church has considered him a candidate for canonization. The Menorcan community, they settled in the northern part of St. Augustine, which became known as the Menorcan Quarter. They became fishermen, farmers, merchants, craftspeople. They reintroduced Catholicism to St. Augustine. They brought Mediterranean customs that survive to this day. The dattle pepper, pilau, cast net fishing, specific architectural traditions. When Spain retook Florida in 1783, most of them stayed, converting to Spanish subjects rather than evacuating with the British. Their descendants remain in St. Augustine today. Family names: Pellicer, Pazzetti, Usina, Manucci, Ponce, Canova are still found in the St. Augustine phone book. Andrew Turnbull. He was released from jail after the Chancery Court proceedings concluded. He moved to Charleston, South Carolina, where he lived as a British subject after the former colony became a state. He petitioned Parliament for compensation for the loss of his Florida land when Spain retook the territory in 1783 and received £916, a fraction of the £40,000 his partners had invested. He died in Charleston on March 13, 1792. The new Smyrna colony he built is considered one of the most significant and tragic episodes in American colonial history. The canal system he had his colonists dig still moves water through what is now New Smyrna Beach, Florida. The enslaved workers. History does not record their names individually or what became of them after the plantation collapsed. They were not freed by the legal proceedings that freed the indentured Europeans. They remain the unanswered question of this story, present in every scene, watching every arrival and departure, carrying an experience that no one in authority thought to document. Their graves, like the graves of the 964 colonists who died at New Smyrna, have never been found.